year was 1881. The sun bled across the eastern plains of the Wyoming Territory, and the light, thin and red, caught the high edges of Cold Rock, the stone formation, which gave the town its name, looked like the jawbone of some long-dead giant. Below it, the single dusty street began to stir. The air was cool, but the dust already held the day's coming heat. It carried the smell of baked earth, sage, and the faint metallic scent of hot iron from the blacksmith's forge, a smell that clung to everything in this town built on hope and hard ground. Cole Mercer led his horse, a powerful gray gelding with a coat the color of morning mist, toward the town's only public well. He moved with a long, slow stride that ate up the ground without any wasted motion. He was a tall man, built of lean muscle and sinew stretched over a frame that looked like it could bend but never break. His face was all angles and planes, weathered by sun and wind to the color of worn leather. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, were constantly scanning, taking in the rooftops, the alleyways, the dark spaces beneath the wooden boardwalks. It was a habit he couldn't shake, a habit that had kept him alive. He stopped the gelding at the trough, working the pump handle with a steady, rhythmic creak. The water gushed out, dark and cold, and the horse drank deeply. Cole splashed some on his own face, the shock of it a welcome sting. His hand, covered by a strip of torn linen wrapped around the knuckles, drifted unconsciously to his side, his fingers tracing the puckered, raised line of a scar beneath his worn cotton shirt. It was an old wound, but it ached with the memory of heat and splintered wood. It was a permanent reminder of a promise he had failed to keep. Cole had ridden into Cold Rock after sunset the night before, a shadow slipping into a town of shadows. He had slept in the livery stable, his saddle for a pillow, the smell of hay and horse sweat a familiar comfort. He never stayed in boarding houses. He never stayed anywhere long enough for the floorboards to learn the sound of his footsteps. It was safer that way, for him, and for everyone else. A rumor, persistent as a coyote on a scent, followed him from territory to territory. It was a whisper that traveled on the telegraph wires and in the letters carried by stagecoach. "Mercer brings a bad wind with him," it said. "Don't get too close. Anyone who stands by Cole Mercer ends up gone." Some said it was a curse. Cole didn't believe in curses. He believed in cause and effect. He believed that he was the cause, and the effect was always loss. He had seen it happen too many times to believe otherwise. His presence was an anchor that dragged other people's ships onto the rocks, so he kept moving, a ghost in a dust-caked coat, never allowing the anchor to settle. The door of the small eatery next to the post office swung open with the cheerful jingle of a small bell. A woman emerged, moving with a quick, purposeful energy. This was June Avery. She was younger than her eyes suggested, with a strength in her slight frame that had been forged in hardship. Her husband had been taken by a fever 2 winters back, leaving her with the eatery, a small patch of garden out back, and a stack of debts. She wore a simple calico dress, faded from countless washings, and her brown hair was pinned up in a practical knot, though a few rebellious strands had already escaped to curl around her face in the dry morning air. She carried a small, freshly painted wooden sign. With brisk movements, she hung it from a nail by the door, cornbread still warm. Her gaze swept the street and landed on the stranger by the well. She'd heard the livery boy talking when he'd delivered her milk, a lone rider, quiet, paid in coin and asked for nothing but a patch of hay for the night. She saw the breadth of his shoulders, the weariness in his posture, the way he held himself apart from the world. There was a story there. She knew. Every soul that drifted through Cold Rock had a story, usually one they were trying to outrun. Cole finished with his horse and tied the reins loosely to a hitching post. The smell of coffee and baking bread pulled at him. He hadn't had a hot meal in 3 days. He pushed open the door to the eatery. The bell jingled again. The inside was small and spare, but immaculately clean. 3 wooden tables, scrubbed pale, stood on a plank floor. The air was thick with the comforting scents of coffee, bacon, and the sweet, grainy aroma of the cornbread. June stood behind a simple counter, wiping it down with a damp cloth. She looked up as he entered, her expression neutral but her eyes observant. "Morning," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Coffee," Cole said. His own voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. "Black." "Sit where you like, I'll bring it over." He chose the table in the corner, the one that gave him a clear view of the door and the single window looking out onto the street. His back was to the wall. Always. He dropped his hat onto the table, revealing dark, sweat-dampened hair. He rested his hands on the tabletop, and it was then that June noticed the wrapping around his right hand. The linen was frayed, stained with dirt and what looked like dried blood around the knuckles. A long tear ran along the side. She brought the coffee over in a thick white ceramic mug. It was steaming, its bitter scent sharp and welcome. He nodded his thanks without looking up, his attention fixed on the street outside. June hesitated for a moment, then went back behind the counter. She opened a small wooden box, the kind used for storing sewing notions. Inside were spools of thread, a thimble, and a small packet of needles. She took out a needle and a spool of sturdy brown thread. She walked back to his table and placed the items next to his mug. "For your hand wrap," she said quietly. "It's coming apart." Cole's head snapped up. His pale blue eyes met hers, and for a second, they were filled with a raw surprise, a deep-seated wariness that startled her. It was the look of a wild animal that has forgotten the feel of a gentle hand. He looked from her face to the needle and thread, then back again. People didn't offer him kindness. They offered him suspicion, wide berths, and warnings to be on his way. "Obliged," he mumbled, his gaze dropping back to the street. The single word was a dismissal, a wall going up. He drank the coffee in slow, measured swallows, feeling its heat spread through his chest. He could feel her gaze on him from behind the counter, not staring, but aware. It made the muscles in his shoulders tighten. He was used to being watched, but this was different. It wasn't the suspicious glance of a sheriff or the calculating look of a card sharp. It was just a look, and that was more unsettling than anything else. He finished the coffee, the dregs thick and gritty at the bottom of the mug. He placed 2 coins on the table, more than enough to cover the cost. He picked up his hat, leaving the needle and thread untouched. His intention was clear. He was leaving. Now, before the sun was fully up, before the town was fully awake, before anything could happen. He stood and turned toward the door. June wiped her hands on her apron, a sudden, inexplicable knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She watched his straight back, the set of his shoulders that seemed to carry a weight far heavier than his saddle roll. He was almost to the door. And then, the words came out, unbidden, a quiet rush of air. "Go slow, this time." Cole froze, his hand on the door latch. He didn't turn around, but she saw his whole body go rigid. The words hung in the still air of the little room, a strange and intimate request from a stranger. He stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Then, without a word, he pushed the door open and was gone, the bell giving a final, lonely jingle. June let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She walked over to the table and picked up the 2 coins. The needle and spool of thread still lay there, a small, rejected offering. Outside. Cole untied his horse, his movements stiff and angry. What did she mean by that, go slow? He never went slow. Slow was dangerous. Slow was how things attached themselves to you. Slow was how you started to care. He swung up into the saddle, the worn leather creaking under his weight. His plan was simple: ride east, follow the sun, and don't look back. Put Cold Rock behind him before it could become anything more than a name on a map. But as he looked down the street, his eyes were drawn to the saloon. The bat-wing doors were already swinging, even at this early hour. Through them, he could see Silas Bragg. Bragg wasn't from Wyoming. He had the soft hands and fancy Eastern suit of a man who made his money with paper and ink, not sweat and calluses. He was a land speculator, a vulture who had followed the promise of the coming railroad. Cole had seen men like him before. They arrived with smiles and contracts, and they left with deeds to land that had been in families for generations. Bragg had a group of local ranchers cornered near the bar, his voice, smooth and persuasive, carried out into the street. "It's progress, gentlemen. The Union Pacific will change everything. Your land is in the direct path. Sell to me now, for a fair price, or be forced to sell to them later for pennies on the dollar. I'm offering you a kindness." Cole saw the fear and indecision on the ranchers' faces. They were good men, men of the land, but they were no match for the legal traps hidden in Bragg's fine print. This was the kind of trouble he made a point to avoid. It wasn't his fight. It wasn't his town. As if to confirm his decision, two men wearing the armbands of the town patrol walked past, their boots thudding on the boardwalk. "Heard Jebediah lost 2 mares last night," one said to the other. "Right out of his pasture. These thieves are getting bold. Sheriff says they're holed up somewhere in the foothills." Cole's hand tightened on the reins. Bragg and his land grabs, horse thieves in the hills. Trouble was brewing in Cold Rock. It was a storm on the horizon, and he had no intention of being around when it broke. He had his own storms to contend with. He nudged the gelding with his heels, turning the horse's head east, away from the town, away from the eatery, away from the woman with the observant eyes. From her window, June watched him. She saw him look toward the saloon, saw the hard set of his jaw. She saw him listen to the patrolman, saw the slight shift in his posture. And she saw the final, decisive act of him turning his horse to leave. He was running. She had been right. But as his lone figure began to move down the street, a silhouette against the rising sun, she had a sudden, certain feeling that settled deep in her bones. The man they called Mercer wasn't just running from horse thieves or the kind of trouble Silas Bragg was stirring up. He was running from a ghost, and it was a ghost that resided not in the hills, but deep inside himself. The sun climbed higher, baking the red dust of Cold Rock's main street into a hard-pan crust, inside her eatery. June Avery moved through the quiet rhythm of her day, the last of the morning customers. A pair of ranch hands heading back out to the plains had left, leaving the scent of fried bacon and lingering coffee in the warm air. June cleared their plates, her movements efficient and practiced. She stacked them by the wash basin, her mind already on the next task, and the one after that. Her life was a chain of such tasks, each link forged from necessity. She untied her apron and sat at the corner table, the one Cole Mercer had occupied. From a small tin box, she emptied a handful of coins, nickels, dimes, a few quarters. She counted them carefully, stacking them into small, precise columns on the scrubbed wood. Her lips moved silently with the tally. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. On a shelf behind the counter, next to a jar of pickled eggs, sat a folded piece of official-looking paper, the tax assessment for the property. It had arrived on the last stagecoach, and its presence felt like a physical weight in the room. The amount due was printed in stark, unforgiving ink. Looking at her meager stacks of coins, a tremor started in her hands. It was a small, frustrating flutter that she tried to still by pressing her palms flat against the table. The garden out back, with its rows of beans and squash and tomatoes, was her margin. It was the difference between scraping by and going under. It fed her and provided extra produce to sell to the stagecoach line. That small patch of earth was everything. Without it, the eatery, the roof over her head, her independence, would all crumble into the dust. Miles away, yet still within sight of the stony peak of Cold Rock, Cole Mercer was not thinking of the future. He was anchored firmly in the present, a place he found safer than memory or hope. He hadn't left. He had ridden out to the edge of the territory, felt the familiar pull of the open plains, and then, inexplicably, had turned his horse around. He told himself it was practical. The gelding had thrown a shoe, and one of his saddle straps was worn dangerously thin. These were truths, but a deeper truth, one he refused to examine, was the echo of a woman's voice saying, "Go slow." He was at the blacksmith's forge, the air ringing with the percussive song of hammer on anvil. Old Man Hemlock, the smithy, was a man of few words and immense, scarred forearms. He left Cole to his own work. Cole had a knack for leather and steel, the quiet, certain crafts of a man who relied only on himself and his horse. He had his saddle draped over a sawhorse, his tools laid out on a piece of burlap. With a sharp awl and waxed thread, he stitched a new piece of leather over the frayed strap, his movements quick and economical. Each pull of the thread was precise, tight. A job done right was a job that wouldn't fail you when you were 100 miles from anywhere. As he worked, his eyes were never still. They lifted from his task every few moments, scanning the line of cottonwood trees that marked the edge of the creek, then sweeping across the low, scrub-covered hills beyond. It was a constant, unconscious surveillance, the ingrained habit of a man who knew how quickly danger could appear from a place of seeming peace. He'd learned that lesson in the high country of Colorado. When 3 riders had come out of a dense aspen grove with the sun behind them, he'd survived that encounter. The riders had not, but the watchfulness had remained, a permanent sentry in his mind. He finished the strap and moved to the horse. He lifted the gelding's hoof, cradling it between his knees, and expertly pried off the loose shoe. He cleaned the hoof, checked for stone bruises, and then selected a new shoe from the smithy's stock. He fired up the forge, the bellows breathing a fierce orange life into the coals. He heated the shoe until it glowed a menacing red, then shaped it on the anvil with sure, powerful blows. The clang of his hammer was a different rhythm from Hemlock's, faster, sharper, more urgent. It was the sound of a man trying to beat back a thought. When the work was done, he paid Hemlock in coin, receiving only a silent nod in return. He saddled the gelding, the new strap firm and secure. The horse was ready. The gear was sound. There was no reason left to stay. And yet, he found himself leading the horse back toward the center of town, his throat dry, the memory of hot, black coffee a convenient excuse. June had just finished washing the last of the dishes when the bell over the door jingled. Her head came up, a flicker of something she couldn't name, anticipation, apprehension stirring within her. It was not Cole. It was Silas Bragg. He filled the doorway, his tailored wool suit and polished boots an affront to the humble simplicity of the eatery. He took off his hat, revealing hair that was perfectly parted and pomaded, and smiled a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. 2 men, rough-looking types who served as his muscle and messengers, lingered on the boardwalk outside. "Mrs. Avery," Bragg said, his voice as smooth as oiled machinery, "a pleasure to see you looking so well." "Mr. Bragg," June replied, her voice flat. She dried her hands on her apron, her spine straightening. She did not invite him to sit. He walked to the counter as if he owned the place, his gaze sweeping over the clean but worn interior. He let his eyes settle on the tax assessment notice on the shelf. Difficult business, running an establishment on your own. So many expenses, so much uncertainty. "I manage," June said. Bragg chuckled softly. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document and a handsome fountain pen with a gold nib, a far cry from the simple quills used at the post office. He laid them on the counter. "I am here to help you manage, my dear. I am prepared to make you a cash offer, a very generous one, for that little plot of garden behind this building." June's heart went cold. She stared at the pen, then at his smiling face. "My garden is not for sale." "Everything is for sale for the right price," Bragg said, his tone still light but with a new, harder edge beneath it. "Think of it, a roll of cash in your hand. No more worrying about taxes, or the cost of seed, or a bad harvest. Enough to get you through a hard winter with ease." "The garden feeds me. It's part of this property. It's not for sale," she repeated, her voice low but firm. The tremor was back in her hands, and she clasped them behind her back. Bragg's smile faded. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let us be frank, Mrs. Avery. The Union Pacific is laying its new spur line. Progress is coming to Cold Rock. That railroad is going to come right through the back end of these properties. I have a charter, and I am acquiring the necessary land. You can sell to me now, a friendly transaction between neighbors, or you can deal with the railroad lawyers later. They are not as personable as I am. You don't want that kind of trouble, do you? The bell over the door jingled again. Both of them turned. Cole Mercer stood there, his tall frame seeming to shrink the small room. He closed the door quietly behind him and moved to the same corner table. He didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge their conversation. He just sat down, placing his hat on the table, his movements deliberate and silent. But his presence changed the very air in the room. The air grew heavier, charged with a new and unpredictable element. June's throat was tight. "I've given you my answer, Mr. Bragg." Bragg shot a dismissive glance at Cole, sizing him up as nothing more than a saddle tramp. He turned his attention back to June, his voice hardening with impatience. "You are making a mistake. Widow. A sentimental one. Sentiment doesn't put food on the table when the snow flies." Cole lifted his head. He hadn't ordered anything. He had just been sitting there, a silent observer. He looked at Bragg. He didn't speak. He didn't stand. He simply looked at him, his pale blue eyes flat and unreadable as desert sky. There was no overt threat in his gaze, no anger. There was just an unnerving stillness, a depth of focus that seemed to strip away Bragg's layers of tailored wool and smug confidence, leaving him exposed and assessed. Bragg, who was used to controlling every room he entered, faltered. He held Cole's gaze for a moment, then another. The silence in the eatery was absolute, broken only by the buzzing of a fly against the window pane. Bragg's face flushed slightly. He opened his mouth to say something, another threat, another persuasion, but the words wouldn't come. The drifter's silent, unwavering stare was more unnerving than a drawn gun. With a choked sound of frustration, Bragg snatched the pen and document off the counter. "You will reconsider," he hissed at June. He threw one last venomous look at Cole, who hadn't blinked. Then he turned on his heel and stormed out, his polished boots loud on the wooden floor. The tension in the room broke. June sagged against the counter, her breath coming out in a shaky sigh. The other patrons, a few old-timers who had been trying to make themselves invisible during the exchange, began to mutter amongst themselves. "That Mercer fellow is trouble," one whispered, not quite quietly enough. "Brings a bad wind, they say." "She shouldn't get mixed up with him," another added, shaking his head. "Bragg's not a man to cross. Now he'll think they're in it together." June heard them. Their fear was a bitter taste in her mouth. She looked at Cole. He was still sitting there, his gaze now directed out the window as if nothing had happened. He had defended her without saying a word, without moving from his chair, and in return, the town was already blaming him, weaving him into the fabric of the trouble he had just dispersed. She walked out from behind the counter, her steps sure again. She picked up the small sewing kit from the shelf where she'd left it that morning. She walked over to his table and placed it beside his hat. He looked from the kit to her face. "If you have to stay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, her words a direct challenge to the gossips and to his own restless nature. "Then you ought to mend that." A muscle twitched in Cole's jaw. He gave a single, curt nod of acceptance, but his eyes, when they met hers, seemed to look straight through her, to a place far beyond the dusty street of Cold Rock. His mind had snagged on her words, "if you have to stay." Staying was the one thing he couldn't do. As he reached for the needle, his fingers clumsy for the first time, an image flared behind his eyes, hot and vivid, not a memory, but a brand on his soul, the smell of pine sap and burning hay, the roar of a fire that consumed the night, the splintering crack of a heavy beam, and a voice, young and desperate, screaming his name until it was swallowed by the smoke. His hand, the one he was wrapping, had been locked in a fist that night, beating against a wall of flame. Useless. It had been locked in a fist ever since. He looked at the needle in his hand, a small, simple tool for mending things. Some things, he knew, could never be mended. He would use her thread. He would drink another cup of her coffee. And tomorrow, before the sun touched the top of Cold Rock, he would be gone. It was the only way he knew how to keep the fire from spreading. The needle felt foreign in Cole's hand. He sat at the corner table, the murmur of the town filtering through the window, a distant hum against the roaring in his own mind. He threaded the needle, his calloused fingers fumbling with the delicate strand. Each movement was a conscious effort, a fight against the tremor that started deep in his muscles. He began to stitch the torn linen wrapped around his knuckles, a slow, clumsy repair. The simple act of mending pulled a thread in his memory, and the past unspooled, hot and choking. Montana. The memory always started with the smell, not the clean scent of pine and cold mountain air, but the acrid stink of burning pitch and horsehair. It was a dry summer, the land thirsty and brittle. The wind, a hot, restless thing, had carried a spark from a lightning strike miles away, nursing it into an inferno that devoured the forest and raced toward their homestead. He had been 17, strong and sure of his place in the world. His brother, Owen, was 12, all lanky limbs and a smile that was missing a front tooth. Owen, who could charm a skittish foal with a soft word and a handful of oats. Owen, who had hero worship in his eyes whenever he looked at Cole. The memory sharpened, focusing on the barn. Flames, orange and alive, licked up the dry timber walls. They moved like hungry animals, devouring everything. The horses screamed, a terrifying sound of pure panic. He and his father had gotten most of them out, their eyes rolling white in the smoke-filled darkness. But then his father had yelled Owen's name. The boy had gone back in. For a newborn calf, forgotten in its pen. The sound of cracking wood, not a gentle pop, but a gunshot explosion as a main support beam gave way. It crashed down, blocking the main doors, a wall of fire. Cole ran to the side hatch, a small opening used for pitching hay. He could see him. Owen, pinned by a fallen piece of the hayloft, his leg trapped. The calf was bleeding beside him, smoke pouring from its lungs. Owen wasn't screaming. He was just looking at Cole, his eyes wide in the hellish orange light. "Cole," he coughed, the name a plume of smoke. "Pull me out! Cole!" Cole had reached through the hatch, his arm extended, his fingers straining. The heat was a physical blow, blistering his skin. "I can't reach, you have to move!" he had screamed, his own voice raw with desperation. "I can't." Owen's voice was getting weaker, thinner. The smoke was a thick, gray blanket wrapping around him, stealing his breath. "Don't leave me, Cole." The cracking of timbers again, louder this time. The roof groaned, preparing to collapse. Cole's hand was a fist, beating against the hot wood of the barn wall, a useless, frantic rhythm of denial. He was helpless. The wood was too thick, the fire too hot, the distance too far. Then the sound he would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. The terrible, final snap of heavy wood, followed by a roar as the roof caved in. And in that roar, Owen's voice was extinguished. Not a scream, just silence, an absence. Cole's fist remained clenched, locked around the ghost of his brother's name. The thread snapped in his fingers. Cole blinked, the eatery coming back into sharp, painful focus. The linen around his hand was only half mended. His knuckles were white, his whole arm rigid. The memory had left the taste of ash in his mouth. He looked out the window, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He had to get out. Now. Before the smoke inside him choked the life out of this place. It was then he saw it. A change in the world outside. The lazy dust devils that had been spinning in the streets suddenly reversed direction, skittering the other way. The wind had shifted. It was coming from the west now, gusting, carrying the rhythmic clang of Old Man Hemlock's forge with it. With the sound came a shower of tiny orange stars, sparks from the anvil, sent sailing on the breeze. Most died in the dust, but one, a resilient little ember, floated over the low roof of the post office. It drifted down, a tiny speck of orange against the blue sky, and landed in the tall, sun-scorched grass that grew against the back wall of June Avery's eatery. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a thin, tentative curl of white smoke rose into the air. Inside, June was kneading dough for the evening's bread. Her hands dusted with flour. She caught a strange smell on the air, something sharp and hot that didn't belong in her kitchen. It was the smell of Montana. She frowned, wiping her hands on her apron, and walked to the back door, pushing it open. The smoke was no longer thin. It was a thick, gray plume, and at its base, a patch of grass was burning with a hungry, crackling sound. The dry timber wall of her kitchen was only a few feet away. "Oh, Lord," she breathed, the words lost in a sudden fit of coughing as the smoke hit her. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She spun around, grabbed the heavy wooden water bucket from its stand by the sink, and lugged it outside. With a desperate heave, she threw the water onto the base of the flames. There was a loud hiss. A cloud of steam and smoke billowed up, engulfing her. The water put out the heart of the fire, but the edges were still creeping outward, devouring the dry grass. Her skirt, whipping in the wind, caught a stray spark, and a small, dark scorch mark appeared on the calico. Cole was on his feet before he even registered the sight of the smoke, the sound of the hiss, the sight of the gray plume, the woman coughing in its midst. It was a scene torn directly from his memory. His chair scraped back with a violent screech. He didn't use the door. He vaulted over the low porch railing in a single, fluid motion, his half-mended hand forgotten. He ripped his worn duster from his shoulders as he ran. June was stumbling back, trying to get to the well pump, her face pale beneath a smudge of soot. The fire was small, but the wind was its ally, pushing it relentlessly toward the wooden building. Cole didn't shout. He didn't think. He acted. He descended on the burning patch of grass, using his heavy coat as a beater, swinging it down with powerful, desperate slaps. Thump, thump, thump. The sounds were dull, brutal. Each impact sent up a shower of sparks and choking black dust. He moved along the fire's edge, his body a barrier between the flames and the building, his face grim, his eyes narrowed to slits. But he wasn't seeing the patch of Wyoming grass. He was seeing the blazing wall of a Montana barn. He was beating back a ghost. His breath was a ragged tear in his throat. June reached his side, her hand on the pump handle. "Cole!" she gasped, but he didn't seem to hear her. He was lost in the rhythm of the violence, striking the ground again and again, long after the last of the flames had been extinguished. He was fighting a fire that no longer existed. The smell of scorched earth filled the air. His eyes were wild, haunted, staring at the blackened ground as if he expected the flames to leap up again. June let go of the pump. She walked toward him, her steps slow and deliberate. He was still breathing hard, his shoulders heaving. His duster was smoking in his hands. She could see the whites all around his pale blue eyes. She reached out and laid her hand on his wrist. It was corded with tension, hard as iron. He flinched at her touch, a violent, reflexive jerk. "Slow down," she said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the roaring in his head. "It's out. The fire is out." He stared at her hand on his wrist, then looked at her face, smudged with soot, her eyes wide and clear. He seemed to see her for the first time. He looked down at the blackened patch of grass, then at his coat in his hands. The frantic energy drained out of him, leaving him hollow and trembling. Their breathing, one ragged and panicked, the other steady and calm, began to fall into the same rhythm. In, out. The world slowly came back into focus. The sound of running feet and shouting reached them. A group of town boys, excited by the drama, came running around the corner of the post office carrying buckets, sloshing water over their boots. Behind them came their parents, their faces etched with concern. The small crowd gathered, murmuring, staring at the scorched earth, at June, at the wild-eyed stranger holding the smoking coat. From across the street, standing in the shade of the saloon's overhang, Silas Bragg watched the scene. He took a slow, deliberate draw from his cigar, his eyes missing nothing. He noted the way the widow put her hand on the drifter's arm. He noted the way the townspeople gathered around them. He saw not a community coming together, but a complication to his plans. Cole became aware of the eyes on him. He felt the familiar urge, the deep, instinctual need to pull away, to saddle his horse and ride until Cold Rock was nothing but a speck behind him. He had done it again. Trouble had found him, and he had brought it right to her doorstep. He took a half step back, pulling his wrist from June's gentle grasp. But as he did, he felt something shift within him, a small, almost imperceptible change. He had reacted. He had run toward the danger, not away from it. He had stayed. It was only for a minute. A single minute measured in heartbeats and smoke. But he hadn't fled. He looked down at his right hand, the fist he had carried for 5 years. The fist that was a memorial to his failure was no longer clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. His fingers were still curled, but they were loose, unlocked. June saw the conflict in his eyes, the flight instinct warring with something new. She saw the tremor in his hands. She ignored the whispers of the crowd. She looked at the man who had just saved her home, who looked more broken and lost than he had a moment before. She gave a small nod, a gesture of dismissal to the gawking neighbors, who slowly began to drift away, their excitement over. Then she turned and walked to the back steps of the eatery. She picked up the tin teapot that had been warming on the sill. She set it down on the top step with a soft clink. She didn't look at him, but her words were clear, meant only for him. "Stay for supper," she said, her voice even. "We'll call it even." The supper was a quiet affair. They ate stew from earthenware bowls, the rich gravy thick with potatoes and carrots from June's garden. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy, filled with the unspoken events of the afternoon, the fire, the fear, and the strange, fragile connection that had sparked between them in the aftermath. The sun had long set, and the only light in the small kitchen came from a single kerosene lamp on the table, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. It created an island of warm, yellow light in the vast, dark expanse of the Wyoming night. When the meal was over, Cole refused to let June clear the table alone. They worked in tandem, a practiced economy of motion that belied the fact they were still strangers. He washed while she dried, the soft clink of plates the only sound. Afterward, June sat in a straight-backed chair by the warm stove, the mending basket in her lap. She picked up the length of torn linen from his hand wrap. It was coarse, stained with trail dust and the ghost of old blood, but in the soft lamplight, her task seemed almost sacred. She threaded a new needle, her movements slow, deliberate. The needle rose and fell, a tiny silver fish swimming through the rough fabric. Each stitch was small, even, and strong. It was a quiet act of restoration, of making something whole again. Her breathing was a soft, steady rhythm in the room, a sound of life, of presence, of staying put. Across the small room, Cole undertook a different kind of ritual. He sat at the table, a clean patch of oilcloth spread before him. On it lay the pieces of his Colt peacemaker. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity that was the mirror opposite of June's calm deliberation. His hands, which had been clumsy with the needle, were now impossibly swift and precise. He used a small brush to clear away fouling and dust from the cylinder, his movements economical and certain. He wiped down the barrel with an oiled rag until the blued steel gleamed with a deep, dark luster. He checked the hammer, the trigger, the intricate inner workings that turned this piece of metal into an instrument of finality. His actions were not about healing, they were about readiness, about ensuring a tool would function without flaw when the moment demanded it. It was the ritual of a man who expected trouble, who lived on a knife's edge, who knew that the only thing you could truly rely on was the certainty of your own weapon. The two of them worked in the shared silence, a study in contrasts. Her slow, steady mending, his quick, precise maintenance. One was an act of weaving things together, the other an act of preparing to break things apart. One was the language of home, the other was the language of the road. June finished a line of stitches and paused, biting the thread with her teeth. She looked at him, at the way the lamplight carved his face into harsh planes of light and shadow. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the constant, low-level vigilance that never seemed to leave him. The question had been forming in her mind all day, a simple, direct inquiry that cut through all the rumors and whispers. "You leave because you're afraid to stay." The question landed in the quiet room with the weight of a stone. Cole's hand stilled. He had just finished reassembling the cylinder, and the soft, oily click as it locked into place was the only answer for a long moment. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the gun in his hands, as if it held the only truth he trusted. A faint, mirthless smile touched one corner of his mouth. "No," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I leave because staying gets people hurt." It was not an explanation. It was a creed, a piece of gospel he had learned by heart in the fiery destruction of his past. He believed it down to his bones. He was a magnet for disaster, a walking, talking bad omen. The kindest thing he could do for anyone, especially for a woman with soot on her cheek and courage in her spine, was to disappear from her life. Before June could respond, before she could challenge the bleak certainty in his voice, a sound ripped through the night. It started as a frantic whinny, sharp with panic, followed immediately by the thunder of unshod hooves on the hard-packed earth of the street. It wasn't the sound of a single horse, but many. The noise grew, a chaotic drumming that vibrated through the floorboards of the kitchen. There were shouts from the livery stable down the street, lights flickering to life in windows. Cole was on his feet in an instant, the gun forgotten on the table. He moved to the front window of the eatery, peering into the darkness. "The stage line's remuda," he said, his voice sharp with assessment. "They've been turned out of their corral." June was right behind him. In the faint moonlight, she could see them, a dozen horses, terrified and riderless, galloping wildly down the main street. They were headed directly for the center of town, a churning mass of panicked animal flesh that could trample anything, or anyone, in its path. "They'll run straight into the mercantile," she said, her voice tight with alarm, "or scatter into the hills. We'll never get them back before the morning stage." Without another word, Cole turned and ran for the back door. June didn't hesitate. She knew what he was thinking, and she knew her role in it. It was an instinctual understanding, a piece of unspoken choreography. Cole vaulted the low fence behind the eatery, landing silently in the alleyway. He ran with a long, ground-eating stride, his path angling to intercept the herd. His mind was clear, focused only on the task. He saw the lead horse, a big roan mare with wild eyes, and knew she was the key. Turner, and the rest would follow. June didn't follow him. Instead, she ran through her garden, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. At the far end was a wide, sturdy wooden gate that opened onto a side lane. It led to a larger holding pen that belonged to the town, currently empty. It was their only chance to contain the horses before they caused real damage or were lost for good. The gate was secured with a heavy wooden beam. It was cumbersome, and she had to put her shoulder into it, grunting with the effort. The wood scraped against its bracket, the sound lost in the approaching thunder of hooves. Cole reached the street just as the horses did. He didn't run at them head-on, that would only make them scatter. Instead, he ran parallel to the herd, matching his speed to theirs. He raised his arms, making himself look bigger, and let out a sharp, piercing whistle. The sound cut through the panic. The roan mare's ears swiveled toward him. She saw the man running alongside her, a steady, unafraid presence in the chaos. He wasn't chasing her. He was guiding her. He whistled again, turning his body slightly, angling toward the side lane. The mare, looking for any direction out of her panic, followed his lead. She veered from the main street, and like a river changing its course, the rest of the herd followed her. June had the gate open. She stood behind it, pressing herself against the fence to stay out of the way, her heart pounding against her ribs. She saw the dark shapes of the horses hurtling toward her out of the gloom, Cole a fleeting shadow running alongside them. The roan mare shot through the gateway, her sides heaving. One by one, the others followed, a torrent of horseflesh pouring into the relative safety of the holding pen. As the last horse cleared the gate, Cole was there, helping June swing the heavy gate shut. They dropped the beam into place just as one of the horses kicked against the wood. And then, silence, or something close to it. The drumming of hooves was replaced by the sound of nervous snorting, the creak of the wooden fence, and the sound of two people gasping for breath. They stood on either side of the gate, their shoulders almost touching, looking into the pen at the milling, sweating horses. They had done it. Together. Without a single word exchanged between them. It had been as natural and seamless as if they had been doing it their whole lives. Cole was the first to break the stillness. He knelt, his eyes on the ground just outside the livery corral they had passed. June brought the lantern from the kitchen, holding it low. Its light illuminated the ground. There were hoof prints, but among them was a set that was different, smaller, unshod, belonging to a pony, not a full-grown horse. Then she saw what Cole was looking at. A piece of rope lay in the dust. It was the rope that had secured the corral gate. She picked it up. The end was not frayed or broken. It had been sliced through with a single, clean stroke of a very sharp knife. "This was no accident," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Someone did this on purpose." Cole took the rope from her, rubbing the clean-cut end between his thumb and forefinger. He looked up, his gaze following the tracks of the small pony. They didn't lead out of town. They led away from the livery, down the dark alley that ran behind the main street, heading directly toward the town's large grain and feed storehouse. A diversion. While the whole town was distracted by the stampede, someone else was heading for the winter supplies. He stood up, a grim understanding settling on his face. This was connected to Bragg. It had to be, creating chaos, stretching the town's resources thin, making people feel unsafe and desperate. It was all part of the same strategy to break their will. He looked at June, at the way the lantern light caught the determination in her eyes. She wasn't afraid. She was angry. She understood, just as he did, that this was an attack on all of them. His hand went to his side, and he felt the torn linen wrap. He had left the half-mended piece on her table. He turned and walked back toward the eatery. June followed, holding the light. Inside the kitchen, the pieces of his gun still lay on the oilcloth. Next to them was the wrap and her sewing needle. He picked up the linen. Her stitches were neat and strong, a dark thread against the faded cloth. It was a small thing, a simple repair, but it felt like an anchor. He folded it carefully and tucked it into the breast pocket of his shirt. June saw the gesture. She saw him place the mended cloth over his heart. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. It was a flicker of warmth in the cold, uncertain night. A single stitch in the unraveling fabric of their town. At the far end of the street, hidden in the deep shadows of the assayer's office, Silas Bragg watched as the lights in the town began to extinguish. Two figures emerged from the alleyway beside him. They were the same rough men who had flanked him in the eatery. One of them was leading a small pony. "Is it done?" Bragg asked, his voice a low rumble. The man nodded. "The grain is soaked. The sacks are slit. It'll be ruined by morning. The whole town panicked over the horses, just like you said." Bragg allowed himself a satisfied smile. He looked toward the faint light still glowing in the window of June Avery's eatery. He didn't know the specifics of what had happened there tonight, but he knew one thing. The town's resolve was weakening. Soon, they would be desperate. And desperate people, he knew, were always willing to sell. He gave a curt nod to his men, a silent dismissal. They melted back into the shadows, leaving him alone to savor his small victory. The moon was a sliver, offering little more than a suggestion of light that turned the Wyoming landscape into a world of charcoal and ink. Cole moved through it not by sight, but by feel, by instinct. The tracks of the unshod pony were faint impressions in the dust of the alleyway, but to him, they were a shouted confession. He followed them away from the chaos of the stampede, his boots making no sound on the hard-packed earth. The air was heavy, damp with the feel of a recent rain shower that had passed through the hills, a brief downpour that had missed the town itself but had fed the creeks. The trail led him away from the town's main street, toward the squat, dark shape of the community storehouse. It sat isolated near the bend of Red Willow Creek, a vital repository holding the sacks of grain and flour that would see Cold Rock through the coming winter. As he drew closer, a new scent cut through the clean, damp smell of sage and wet earth. It was the sharp, chemical bite of kerosene. His body went rigid. His hand fell to the grip of his Colt, the cool, checkered walnut of familiar and grim comfort. He slowed his pace, melting into the deep shadow of a lone juniper tree. Two figures were moving near the storehouse wall. They were silhouettes, their movements hurried and furtive. One held a lantern turned down low, casting a sickly yellow puddle of light. The other was splashing liquid from a can onto the dry timber walls and the wooden loading dock. The sloshing sound was obscene in the quiet of the night. Cole's mind worked with cold, swift clarity. This was the real attack. The stampede had been a child's prank designed to pull every eye in another direction. This was an act of war, an attempt to starve the town into submission, to make them so desperate they would sign away their land for a sack of Bragg's flour. The quiet fury that rose in him was an old, familiar friend. It was the fire that had forged him. One of the men produced a match. The tiny flare of light illuminated his face for a split second, a mean, rat-like face Cole had seen loafing outside the saloon. The man touched the match to the kerosene-soaked wood. The fire did not start with a crackle. It erupted with a deep, hungry whoosh, a sheet of orange flame climbing the wall with terrifying speed. Cole did not hesitate. He drew his peacemaker, the sound of the hammer being cocked a sharp, metallic threat in the night. He didn't aim at the men. Not yet. He aimed at the sky. The gun bucked in his hand, and the shot was a deafening roar that ripped the night apart. The muzzle flash was a brief, violent star. The two saboteurs cried out in shock and terror. They dropped the can and the lantern, which smashed on the ground, and scrambled for their horses tethered nearby. In a panic, they swung into their saddles and spurred the animals hard, not back toward the town, but away from it, toward the quickest escape route, the old wooden bridge that spanned Red Willow Creek. Cole broke from cover, running hard. The fire was already eating its way up the storehouse wall, the light flickering and growing, casting his long shadow before him. He could deal with the fire later. First, he had to deal with the men who started it. He vaulted a low fence and ran for his own horse, which he'd left tied in a small grove. He was in the saddle in a single, fluid motion, the gelding leaping into a gallop without needing to be told. The chase was on. The Red Willow Bridge was a narrow, rickety structure, built 10 years prior and never properly maintained. The recent rain in the hills had turned the creek below into a churning, muddy torrent that slammed against the bridge's wooden pilings. Cole could hear the roar of the water even over the sound of his horse's hooves. The two riders hit the bridge at a full gallop. The entire structure shuddered and groaned under the sudden, violent weight. Timbers creaked in protest. As the second rider thundered across, a thick plank in the center of the bridge, its supports weakened by the relentless current, suddenly snapped upward. It didn't break off completely, but it was dislodged, a wooden spear pointing at the sky, leaving a treacherous gap in the flooring. Cole was closing the distance. He could see the men clearly now, their faces pale with fear in the growing light of the fire behind them. He slowed his horse as he approached the bridge, his eyes fixed on his targets. His gun was up, his arm steady. The rage inside him was a cold, clean thing. They had threatened the town. They had threatened June's home. The answer was simple, final. And then, a light appeared at the other end of the bridge, a steady, golden glow. It was a storm lantern, held high. Behind it was a figure, June. She must have seen him go, must have followed. She was carrying the lantern in one hand and a heavy-looking bucket in the other. He saw the flicker of fire not just at the storehouse, but on the bridge itself. One of the riders, in his haste, must have dropped a lit torch or a cigar, and a small flame was now licking at one of the main support pilings, feeding on the dry, creosoted wood. Cole reined his horse to a halt at the edge of the bridge, his attention torn. The men were getting away. The bridge was on fire, and June was walking toward the flames. One of the fleeing riders, seeing his escape clear, looked back and laughed, a cruel, triumphant sound that carried over the roar of the water. That sound focused all of Cole's rage. He brought the Colt up again, taking careful aim at the center of the man's back. Suddenly, June was there. She had crossed the bridge, her steps unnervingly steady. She reached him, and her hand closed over his wrist, the one holding the gun. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Slow down," she said, her voice strained but clear over the noise. "Don't shoot wild." Her touch was a jolt, like being plunged into icy water. It cut through the heat of his anger. He looked from the rider to her face, illuminated by her lantern. Her eyes were not pleading. They were commanding. It wasn't a request to spare a man's life. It was a demand that he be better than his own rage. The second rider's horse, spooked by the dislodged plank, suddenly shied. The man lost his balance, tumbling from the saddle and landing hard on the far bank. His horse, reins trailing, bolted into the darkness. Cole felt the change happen inside him, a conscious shift. His fury was still there, a white-hot coal in his gut, but her words, her touch, had given him a different path. He was still holding the gun, but his aim moved. He tracked the remaining rider, the one who had laughed. He didn't aim for the man. He aimed for a point just in front of him. He squeezed the trigger. The shot was precise, a masterclass in marksmanship. The bullet didn't touch the horse or the man. It sliced through the leather of the right-hand rein, just below the bit. The rein snapped. The horse, feeling the sudden lack of guidance on one side and spurred by panic, veered sharply. It stumbled, and the rider, caught completely by surprise, was thrown clear. He hit the ground with a grunt of pain and lay still, not dead, but no longer a threat. At the same instant, June moved past him. She set down the lantern and threw the contents of her bucket, a heavy load of sand, onto the flames licking at the bridge piling. The fire hissed and sputtered, choked by the sand. But as she leaned over to smother the last embers, her boot slipped on the wet, mossy wood. Her knee buckled. With a small cry, she lost her footing and slid toward the gaping hole left by the broken plank. Cole moved without thinking. He dropped from his saddle, lunging forward. He caught her arm just as her legs slipped into the void. The river roared below them, a hungry, churning mouth. For a heart-stopping second, her entire weight was on his arm. He gritted his teeth, his muscles straining, and pulled her back onto the solid part of the bridge. She collapsed against him, her body trembling. He held her, his arm wrapped around her waist, keeping her steady. They stood there for a long moment, the only two still points in a world of chaos: the roar of the river, the crackle of the distant fire, the groaning of the damaged bridge. It all faded to a dull background hum. All he could feel was the frantic beat of her heart against his chest, the warmth of her breath on his neck. All he could smell was the mixture of sweat from their exertion, the damp scent of the river, the sharp tang of ash, and the faint, clean scent of the soap she used. Their heartbeats, one frantic, the other pounding with adrenaline, slowly began to quiet, falling into a shared, exhausted rhythm. He eased his grip, and she stood on her own, though she stayed close, her hand still resting on his arm. They looked at each other in the lantern light. No words were spoken, none were needed. In her eyes, he saw not gratitude, but a profound and unwavering understanding. In his, she saw the storm finally begin to calm. His gaze fell on something lying near where the first rider had fallen, a small leather satchel. He walked over and picked it up. It was heavy, inside. He found not coins, but a sheaf of papers. He held them up to the lantern light. They were surveyor's maps of the land along the proposed railroad route, with specific parcels outlined in red ink. June's garden was one of them, and on the bottom corner of each map was a small, embossed seal, a capital B, identical to the one on Silas Bragg's fancy fountain pen. Proof. He looked back at the bridge, at the broken plank. He couldn't leave it like that. Using a length of rope from his saddle, he worked in the flickering light, lashing the plank back down as a temporary fix. It was a rough repair, but it would hold. June watched him, her expression unreadable. When he was finished, he turned to face her. The night was quiet again, save for the river. She reached out, not to his arm this time, but placed her palm flat against the center of his chest. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart beneath her hand. "Don't be gone in the morning," she said, her voice a low, soft plea that was also a command. The church bell did not ring for worship. It rang with a sharp, insistent clang that was both a summons and an alarm, a sound that pulled the people of Cold Rock from their homes and businesses. They filed into the small wooden church, their faces etched with the anxiety of the night and the uncertainty of the morning. The air inside, usually smelling of old hymnals and lemon oil polish, was thick with the scent of damp wool, nervous sweat, and fear. They were not here to pray. They were here for a reckoning. The pews were packed tight, ranchers in their Sunday best, merchants with worried frowns, mothers hushing their children. They stood in the aisles and crowded the back wall. At the front, before the simple wooden altar, stood a long table. This was the courtroom of Cold Rock, and behind it sat Judge-Preacher Pike. Pike was a man carved from the unforgiving landscape he served. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, his hands were large and calloused, and his eyes, deep set beneath a shock of white hair, held both the stern judgment of the Old Testament and the quiet compassion of the New. He was both the town's spiritual guide and its final legal authority, a dual role common on the frontier where a man's character was his only true credential. Silas Bragg stood to one side of the table, flanked by his two hired men. He looked calm, almost bored, a man entirely confident in his position. He held a leather portfolio filled with contracts. On the other side stood June Avery. She was alone, but she stood straight, her hands clasped in front of her, the leather satchel they had found at the bridge resting on the floor beside her. Cole Mercer was not at the front. He stood near the back door, a silent, watchful presence, his arms crossed over his chest. He was there, but he remained apart, a man still not sure of his place. Pike slammed a heavy wooden gavel on the table. The sound echoed in the hushed room. "This is not a formal court of law," he began, his voice a low rumble that filled the church. "But we are a community of laws. Mr. Bragg has requested this meeting to present his land proposals, and in light of the events of last night, a fire at the town storehouse and a dangerous stampede, it seems we have much to discuss. Mr. Bragg, you have the floor." Bragg stepped forward, opening his portfolio. He smiled, a thin, patronizing expression that did not touch his eyes. "Thank you, Judge, friends, neighbors. Progress is a powerful and sometimes disruptive force. The Union Pacific Railroad is that force, and it is coming. I am merely its humble agent." He held up one of the contracts, a sheaf of papers filled with dense, black script. "I represent a consortium with a federal charter to acquire land for the new spur line. I am empowered to offer you a fair, cash price for the small parcels of your property required for the right-of-way. This is a generous offer, a chance to profit from the future." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over their worried faces. Then his voice hardened. "However, time is of the essence. The surveyor's schedule is not flexible. Any landowner who refuses this offer, who chooses to obstruct the path of progress, will find themselves facing legal action not from me, but from the railroad's attorneys in Cheyenne. They are not as understanding as I am. You will be sued for impeding a federally chartered project. I urge you to sign today and avoid such unpleasantness." A low, angry murmur went through the crowd. It was blackmail, plain and simple, wrapped in the language of the law. Before the murmur could grow into a roar, June stepped forward. She bent down and picked up the leather satchel. Her movements were calm and deliberate. "Judge Pike," she said, her voice clear and steady, resonating through the tense silence. "Before anyone signs anything, I have some items I think the town should see." All eyes turned to her. Bragg's smile tightened at the edges. June opened the satchel. The first thing she pulled out was the length of rope Cole had found, the end cleanly sliced by a knife. "This is the rope that secured the gate on the stage line's corral. It was not chewed through or broken. It was cut. The stampede was no accident." She then laid the surveyor's maps on the table, spreading them out for Pike to see. "These were in this satchel, which was dropped last night at the Red Willow Bridge by one of the men who set fire to our storehouse." She pointed to the red-inked outlines. These maps show the exact parcels Mr. Bragg wishes to acquire. And here," she tapped the embossed seal on the corner of a map, "is his mark." A gasp went through the crowd. Bragg's face went pale, then flushed with anger. "This is an outrage. That bag was stolen from my office days ago. This woman and her drifter friend are trying to slander my good name." Pike held up a hand for silence. He looked from the maps to June. "You say you know who set the fire?" "I do," June said simply. "And Mr. Mercer was a witness to the entire event." Pike's gaze shifted to the back of the church. "Mr. Mercer, will you come forward?" Cole pushed himself off the wall. Every eye in the room followed him as he walked down the central aisle, his boots making a slow, steady thud on the wooden floor. He stopped beside June, a quiet pillar of support. He did not look at the crowd. He looked only at Pike. "Tell us what you saw," Pike commanded. Cole's voice was low and devoid of emotion, the voice of a man reporting facts. "I followed the tracks from the livery. 2 men. They used kerosene on the storehouse wall. I fired a warning shot. They fled on horseback toward the Red Willow Bridge. I pursued them." He paused. "There was a fire on the bridge as well. They were trying to burn it, to block the only road out. They fell from their horses. They dropped the satchel. I have them tied up at the sheriff's office now." He said nothing of June's presence, nothing of her bravery, nothing of his own skilled shooting. He simply laid out the events, stark and unadorned. His calm, factual testimony was more powerful than any impassioned speech. Bragg exploded. "A convenient story cooked up by a thief and a saddle tramp, I'll ask all of you," he said, turning to the crowd, his voice filled with righteous indignation as he pointed a trembling finger at Cole. "Was Cold Rock not a peaceful town before this man arrived? Did this trouble not start the very day he rode in? He carries a curse with him. He is the one who brings fire and chaos, and he has clearly manipulated this poor widow to serve his own dark purposes." The accusation hung in the air. He had skillfully turned the town's own superstitions against Cole. The whispers started again, the old fears resurfacing. Maybe Bragg was right. Maybe Mercer was the problem. Pike looked from Bragg's furious face to Cole's impassive one. He looked at the hard evidence on his table. He had maps with Bragg's seal, and he had 2 men in a cell who could be questioned. But he also had a town on the verge of tearing itself apart with suspicion. He brought the gavel down again, the sharp crack silencing the room. "There are too many accusations and not enough facts for a final judgment," Pike declared, his voice cutting through the tension. "But there is enough doubt to warrant caution." He looked directly at Bragg. "I am hereby suspending any and all land contract negotiations. For 3 days. I am sending a deputy to Cheyenne with these documents to confirm their authenticity and the extent of your charter. Until we have a clear answer from the territorial government, no contracts will be signed. No land will change hands in Cold Rock." A collective sigh of relief went through the pews. It was a temporary reprieve, but it was a victory. Bragg's face was a mask of thunder. He had been outmaneuvered. June, however, knew that 3 days wouldn't solve their most immediate problem. She addressed Pike again, her voice ringing with a new and unexpected strength. "Judge, a ruling from Cheyenne won't replace the grain and flour that was destroyed last night. We can't sit and wait for 3 days. We need to help ourselves. I propose we hold a town fair, a fundraiser, this Saturday. We can sell baked goods, offer rides, have a shooting contest. We can raise the money ourselves to repair the storehouse and replace what was lost." The idea was audacious, a bold declaration of resilience in the face of attack. A murmur of approval spread through the crowd. It was something to do, a way to fight back that didn't involve guns or lawyers. Then, from the front, a quiet voice spoke. "I can build the frame." Everyone turned to look at Cole. He was speaking to June, but his words were for the whole town. "For the new storehouse wall, I can have the framework up by Saturday." It was more than an offer of labor. It was a promise. It was the statement of a man who intended to stay. The townspeople looked from June, with her fierce, protective spirit, to Cole, with his quiet, capable strength. In that moment, They didn't see a grieving widow and a cursed drifter. They saw a team, a partnership, forged in fire and crisis, that felt as natural and right as the sunrise over the plains. The last vestiges of fear in their eyes began to be replaced by something else, hope. Bragg saw it too. He saw his plan to divide and conquer crumbling before his eyes. He saw these two people, this unlikely pair, becoming a symbol of the town's defiance. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. As the meeting broke up and the people filed out into the morning sun, their conversations buzzing with plans for the fair, Bragg slipped out the side door. He found his two remaining men waiting for him in the alley, the ones who had been with him in the church. Their faces were sullen and fearful. Bragg grabbed the front of one man's shirt, his voice a venomous whisper. "They're having a party, a festival to celebrate their own stupidity. Let them." He shoved the man back against the wall. "Enjoy the music, buy a pie, and when the fair is over, I want you to clean this town out, burn it all down. Understood?" The men nodded, their eyes wide. The game was no longer about contracts and legal tricks. It had escalated, and Silas Bragg was done playing by any rules but his own. For 2 days, Cold Rock was a hive of determined activity. The cloud of fear and suspicion that had settled over the town was burned away by the bright, hot flame of common purpose. Women who hadn't spoken in years over some forgotten slight now worked side by side, baking pies and kneading dough. Men pooled their resources, donating lumber, nails, and precious hours of their labor. The sound of saws and hammers replaced the sound of whispers. It was the sound of a town rebuilding not just a wall, but its own heart. Saturday arrived bright and clear, the sky a vast, clean canvas of blue. The fair wasn't grand, but it was vibrant. Strings of colorful pennants, sewn from old dresses and feed sacks, were strung between the eatery and the mercantile, fluttering like captured butterflies in the gentle breeze. The main street was filled with makeshift stalls. The air was a rich tapestry of smells, the sweet, yeasty scent of June's bean soup simmering in a great black kettle, the smoky perfume of roasting corn, the sugary tang of apple pies cooling on a rack. From the end of the street came the cheerful, energetic sawing of a fiddle, playing a lively reel that made the children want to dance. The children were everywhere, their faces scrubbed clean, their laughter the day's true music. They ran races, and at a small stall run by the blacksmith, they took turns shooting corks from a bottle with a toy rifle. The prize for a direct hit a piece of hard candy. The centerpiece of it all was a large, empty oak barrel, a slit cut into its top. A sign, painted in June's neat hand, read, "For the storehouse, for Cold Rock." Throughout the morning, a steady stream of people ranchers, storekeeps, even the taciturn stagecoach driver dropped coins and folded bills into the slot. The sound of the money hitting the bottom a small, satisfying thud of defiance. June was in the center of it all, a whirlwind of calm efficiency. She ladled soup, cut slices of cornbread, and made change, a smile and a word of encouragement for everyone. A sheen of sweat glistened on her brow, and a wisp of hair had escaped its pins to stick to her cheek. But her eyes were bright with a fierce pride. She was no longer just the town's widow, running a small eatery. She was a leader, the quiet core around which the town's spirit had rallied. A short distance away, at the site of the damaged storehouse, Cole worked. He was stripped to the waist, his back and shoulders a landscape of lean, hard muscle that moved with fluid power under his sun-darkened skin. The ugly, puckered scar on his side was a pale, stark line against his tan. He worked with a silent, relentless focus, ignoring the noise and celebration of the fair. The rhythmic thud of his hammer was a steady counterpoint to the fiddle's lively tune. He was not just driving nails, he was setting roots. Each swing was a declaration. I am here, I am building, I will not run. He had erected the entire framework for the new wall, a clean, strong skeleton of fresh-cut pine that smelled of resin and promise. The townspeople would watch him for a moment as they passed, their expressions a mixture of awe and a new, solidifying respect. He was no longer Mercer, the cursed drifter. He was Cole, the man who was helping them rebuild. Several times, his eyes would meet June's across the bustling street. No words were exchanged. There was no need. A shared understanding flowed between them, an invisible current of mutual reliance and a quiet, growing tenderness that was as real and tangible as the dust under their feet. The sweat that dripped from his chin as he worked was the same sweat that beaded on her collarbone as she stood over the hot soup kettle. They were separate, yet together, two halves of the same determined effort. The afternoon sun was high and hot when the change came. It began subtly. The breeze, which had been gentle and playful, died away completely. An unnatural stillness fell over the fair, and the pennants hung limp on their strings. The air grew thick, heavy, and hard to breathe. Then, on the western horizon, the clean blue of the sky began to be smudged by a dirty, yellow-brown haze that grew with alarming speed. The old-timers knew the sign. "Dust storm," one of them muttered, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. "And a bad one's coming." The fiddle music faltered and then stopped. Laughter died in the children's throats. The joyful hum of the fair was replaced by a low, ominous moan that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was the sound of the wind, a vast and powerful beast gathering itself for a charge. Then it hit, not as a gust, but as a solid wall of wind and sand. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of roaring, blinding brown. The carefully constructed stalls rocked and swayed. Canvases were ripped from their moorings, flapping like the wings of panicked birds. The colorful pennants were torn from their strings and sent cartwheeling into the chaos. People cried out in alarm, shielding their eyes, their mouths filling with grit. In the midst of the sudden pandemonium, two figures moved with purpose. They were Bragg's men, the ones who had been lingering at the edge of the fair all day, their faces sullen. They had been waiting for this. The storm was their cover. They converged on the donation table, where the large oak barrel, heavy with the town's hopes, was now untended. One of them grabbed the barrel, trying to heave it onto his shoulder. "Get the money!" he yelled to his partner over the howl of the wind. But Cole was already moving. He had seen their intent in the split second before the dust consumed everything. He launched himself through the blinding curtain of sand, a silent, furious shape. He slammed into the first man, driving him back from the barrel. The man grunted, stumbling, and Cole shoved him hard, sending him sprawling into the dust. The second thug swung a heavy piece of a broken stall frame. Cole saw the motion at the last second and tried to turn, but the blow caught him on the side of the head. The impact was a dull, sickening thud. Stars exploded behind his eyes, and the roaring of the wind became a deafening buzz. His knees buckled, and he went down, the taste of blood and grit suddenly sharp in his mouth. June had seen the start of the scuffle just as the worst of the dust hit. Her first instinct was to run to Cole, but a group of small children, separated from their parents, were huddled by her soup kettle, crying in terror as a large canvas tent began to collapse near them. Without a second thought, she grabbed the edge of a heavy burlap tarp. "Get under here!" she yelled, her voice a sharp command that cut through their fear. She pulled the heavy cloth over them, creating a small, temporary shelter, her body shielding them from the wind and debris. Her eyes, stinging from the sand, desperately searched the swirling brown chaos for a sign of Cole. Through the haze, she saw him fall. A cry of fear and rage caught in her throat. Before she could move, another figure materialized out of the storm. It was Silas Bragg. He was wearing a long coat and a pair of goggles, and he looked entirely unruffled by the tempest. He walked with an unhurried, predatory calm to where Cole lay struggling to rise. He ignored him, stepping past him as if he were nothing more than a piece of refuse. Bragg stopped beside the donation barrel. He held out a piece of paper to the thugs. "A writ of emergency seizure," he announced, his voice amplified by the wind. "In the interest of public safety, I am impounding these funds for safekeeping." The remaining thug, emboldened by Bragg's presence, reached for the barrel again. "Get your hands off that!" The voice was low, fierce, and shaking with fury. June had left the shelter of the children and was standing there, her dress whipped by the wind, her face a mask of defiant rage. Bragg turned to her, a slow, condescending smile on his face. "Mrs. Avery, you should be taking shelter. This is official business." He tried to lift the heavy barrel himself, but June was faster. She lunged forward and seized the barrel, her arms wrapping around it, her small frame a stubborn shield. She was no match for his strength, but she held on with the tenacity of a bulldog. "This money belongs to the people of Cold Rock," she spat, the words gritty with the sand in her mouth. "You will not touch it." Bragg's smile vanished. "You are interfering with an agent of the charter. Sign this receipt, and give me the barrel." "I'll sign nothing while the dust is still flying," she said, her eyes blazing. It was in that moment that the wind, as if obeying some cosmic command, began to subside. The deafening roar lessened to a moan, then a whisper. The thick, brown curtain began to thin, revealing a scene of devastation. Stalls were overturned, goods were scattered, and the entire street was coated in a thick layer of sand. And in the center of it all stood June, her arms wrapped around the donation barrel, facing down Silas Bragg. Slowly, the townspeople emerged from their shelters. They saw June's defiant stand. They saw Bragg and his men looming over her. They saw Cole pushing himself up onto one knee, blood trickling from a cut on his temple. And without a word, they began to move, one by one, then in small groups. They walked forward until they formed a silent, solid wall behind June. The blacksmith held a hammer. A rancher held a coiled length of rope. They were no longer a scattered crowd. They were a unified body. Judge Pike was the last to emerge, his white hair coated in dust. He banged his heavy walking stick on the ground. "That's enough, Bragg," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "The storm is over, and so is this." Bragg looked at the wall of determined, angry faces. He looked at Cole, who was now fully on his feet. His eyes locked on Bragg with a cold and deadly promise. He knew he was beaten, for now. With a sneer, he turned and stalked away, his men scrambling after him like beaten dogs. The street was quiet. The only sound was the last whisper of the wind. Cole took a step toward June, his legs unsteady. He wanted to say something. He wanted to tell her that her courage had left him breathless. He wanted to promise her that he would never let anything like this happen again. He wanted to tell her that the thought of her being hurt had terrified him more than any fire, any gun. But the words were a tangled knot in his throat. He stopped a few feet from her. Their eyes met across the ruined, dusty fairground. The whole town was watching, but in that moment, they were the only two people in the world. He couldn't speak. He didn't have to. His eyes, clear and steady despite the blood on his face, said it all. They held a raw, unguarded promise, a silent vow that was more binding than any spoken word. "I will stay." The cleanup after the dust storm was a quiet, communal act of restoration. People swept sand from their porches, righted overturned tables, and gathered scattered goods with a weary but unbroken spirit. The sun set, painting the bruised-looking sky in shades of violet and orange, and a profound quiet settled over Cold Rock. It was the quiet of exhaustion, but also of a shared and stubborn survival. Cole had finished securing a new tarp over the storehouse frame, his movements slow and stiff. The cut on his temple had been cleaned and bandaged by the doctor's wife, a thin white line against his sun-darkened skin. June had worked until the last of her supplies were put away, the donation barrel now locked safely inside the eatery. When the street was finally empty and the moon began to rise, she found him standing by the well, staring out into the vast, dark plains as if looking for an escape route he no longer intended to take. She didn't call his name. She simply walked to his side, carrying a single lantern. The light cast a small, intimate circle around them, a sanctuary against the immense darkness. "Walk with me," she said, her voice soft. It wasn't a question. He fell into step beside her without a word. They walked away from the town, past the last of the houses, their footsteps the only sound on the dusty path. She led him toward a small grove of birch trees that grew near the creek. their pale, slender trunks glowing like ghosts in the moonlight. The air here was cooler, filled with the gentle murmur of the water and the rhythmic, sawing song of crickets and cicadas. It was a place of deep, abiding peace. June hung the lantern on a low-hanging branch, its light filtering softly through the leaves, dappling the ground in shifting patterns of gold and shadow. They stood in the quiet, the tension of the day slowly seeping out of them, leaving a raw and vulnerable space between them. From the pocket of her apron, June took out a small, unassuming object. It was a simple wooden box, worn smooth with age, about the size of a man's palm. She held it out to him. "This came this morning, before the fair started," she said. "The stage driver said it was misdelivered here months ago. Got lost in a pile of old mail. He found it when he was cleaning out his office. It's addressed to a C. Mercer General Delivery, Cold Rock." Cole stared at the box in her hand as if it were a coiled snake. He didn't take it. His hands, which had been resting at his sides, slowly curled into fists. He knew, with a bone-deep certainty, what was inside. He had mailed it from Montana 5 years ago, a desperate, foolish attempt to rid himself of a memory. But the past, he was learning, had a way of circling back. "I don't want it," he said, his voice a harsh rasp. June didn't pull her hand back. "It's yours, Cole," she said gently. Slowly, as if it weighed 1,000 pounds, he reached out and took the box. His fingers trembled slightly as he worked the small clasp. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was an old brass lighter. It was dented and scratched from years of use, but the engraving on the side was still clear in the lantern light. 2 simple letters, O.M. Owen Mercer. A wave of darkness washed over Cole's face. His eyes, which had begun to hold a fragile warmth when he looked at June, became bleak, empty pools of remembered pain. The light in them was extinguished, smothered by a grief so profound it was a physical presence in the small, quiet grove. He snapped the box shut, the sound a sharp crack of finality. "He was my brother," Cole said, the words forced out, each one a piece of broken glass. He didn't need to say more, but the dam of his silence, which had held back the flood for 5 long years, had finally been breached, standing there in the gentle light, with this woman whose quiet strength had somehow slipped past all his defenses. The story came pouring out. "It was a forest fire," he began, his gaze fixed on the dark water of the creek, seeing instead a river of flame. "In Montana, it moved so fast. We were trying to get the horses out of the barn." He told her everything, the heat, the smoke, the screaming animals. He told her about Owen, lanky and brave and foolish, running back in for a calf. He described the heavy beam falling, the terrible finality of the sound, the way it had blocked the only escape. His voice broke, becoming thick with unshed tears. "I was at the side hatch. I could see him. He was trapped. He was just looking at me." He held up his right hand, the one that had been wrapped in the mended linen, and clenched it into a fist so tight the knuckles were white. "I couldn't reach him. The fire, it was too hot. The wood was too thick. All I could do was beat on the wall." He looked at his own fist as if it were a loathsome, foreign thing. "He asked me not to leave him, and then the roof came down. The sound, it just stopped." For the first time since that night, he gave voice to the fear that had been his constant companion, the guilt that had driven him from town to town, from one lonely camp to the next. "I locked my hand that night," he whispered, the admission a ragged tear in the fabric of the night. "And I haven't been able to open it since. Every time I get close to someone, every time I think about staying, I feel the heat of that fire, and I know I'll just end up burning them too. It's better to leave. It's safer for everyone if I just keep moving." He fell silent, his shoulders slumped, the full weight of his past finally confessed and crushing him. The crickets chirped, the water murmured, the world continued on, indifferent to his private hell. June listened without interrupting, her heart aching with a compassion that was almost painful. When he finished, She didn't offer empty words of comfort. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault. She simply closed the small space between them. She reached out and laid her hand gently over his clenched fist. Her touch was warm, her skin soft against his rough, calloused knuckles. His entire arm was rigid, a bar of iron. "Open it," she said, her voice a soft, steady anchor in his storm of memory. Slow. He shook his head, a violent, negative motion. "I can't." "Yes, you can," she insisted, her grip firm but gentle. "Let it go, Cole, slow." He stared down at their hands, at her slender fingers covering his locked fist. He squeezed his eyes shut. The image of the burning barn, of Owen's face in the flames, roared in his mind. But underneath it, he could feel the steady, living warmth of her hand. It was an anchor in the present, a counterpoint to the fire of the past. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and then he tried. The muscles in his forearm screamed in protest. It was like trying to bend iron, but he focused on her voice, on the feel of her hand, slowly, painfully, one finger at a time. He began to release the tension, the little finger, then the next, then the middle. Each movement was a monumental act of will. Finally, the index finger and thumb uncurled. His hand lay open, palm up, in hers. It was trembling violently, but it was open. His breath escaped him in a long, ragged sigh that was almost a sob. He opened his eyes. They were wet with tears he refused to let fall. She picked up the brass lighter from the box and placed it in his open palm. "Try," she whispered. His thumb, still shaking, found the worn flint wheel. He flicked it. Once, twice. Nothing but a shower of sparks. He was about to give up, to let the failure confirm everything he believed about himself. "Slow," she said again, her voice a gentle command. He took another breath. He slowed his movement, pressing the wheel with a steady, deliberate pressure. Click. A tiny flame sputtered to life. It wavered for a moment, then caught, standing tall and steady in the still night air. It was a small, fragile thing, but it burned with a clean, unwavering light. It did not roar, it did not consume. It simply was, a point of warmth and light in the vast darkness. He stared at the flame, mesmerized. It was just a light, a tool, no longer a symbol of all he had lost, but simply what it was, a memory of his brother held in his open hand. They stood like that for a long time, the only sound their shared breathing. Then, together, they sank to the ground, sitting on the cool, damp earth at the base of a birch tree. He finally closed the lighter, and the darkness rushed back in, but it was no longer menacing. It was peaceful. He leaned his head back against the smooth, pale bark of the tree, and she rested her head on his shoulder. He didn't put his arm around her. She didn't seek his embrace. They just sat, shoulder to shoulder, a silent, profound intimacy passing between them. No kisses were exchanged. No passionate words were spoken. Their connection was being forged in a place deeper than that, in the quiet crucible of shared vulnerability and acceptance. They sat that way until the first, pale hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. In the long, healing silence, a single, unspoken thought took shape, passing from her heart to his. It was not a question, and it was not a demand. It was a simple, fundamental truth that had become the new foundation of both their lives. "Don't leave before we've had a chance to start." Far across the creek, on the low hill overlooking the town, a single light still burned in the window of Silas Bragg's rented house. The conspiracy was not sleeping. The threat had not passed. But in the quiet birch grove, two people had found a strength in each other that was more powerful than any fire, any storm, any darkness. They were ready for the morning. The morning of the third day dawned with a strange new sound. It was the rhythmic, percussive clang of hammers on steel, a sound that spoke of a world far bigger and faster than Cold Rock. A crew of railroad men, working with startling speed, had laid a short, temporary spur of track and erected a makeshift platform of raw pine planks near the edge of town. This was to be the stage for the final act of Silas Bragg's play. A special test engine, a marvel of black iron and polished brass, was scheduled to arrive at noon, a tangible, steaming symbol of the progress Bragg claimed to represent. He intended to make a spectacle of it. He had arranged for a table and a chair to be set up on the platform, turning the arrival of the train into a public signing ceremony. He stood there now, dressed in a new, crisply pressed suit, the very picture of inevitable authority. He held his portfolio of contracts, his fountain pen at the ready. He expected the sight of the powerful locomotive, the embodiment of the future, to be the final irresistible pressure that would break the town's will. The people of Cold Rock gathered, but they did not form an orderly line to sign away their land. They stood in a wide, silent semicircle around the platform, their faces grim and unreadable. They had come not to capitulate, but to witness. A path opened through the crowd. June Avery walked through it, her head held high. She carried no weapon, but in her hands she held the leather satchel full of maps and the damning, clean-cut length of rope. She took her place at the front of the crowd, directly before the platform, and set the evidence on an upended crate. Moments later, another path opened. Cole Mercer walked through, and he was not alone. Behind him were three men. The first was Old Man Hemlock, the blacksmith, his immense, soot-stained hands scrubbed clean, his expression thunderous. The second was Silas Croft, the local stage line station master, a wiry man whose face was a mask of cold fury over the sabotage of his corral. The third was a nervous-looking young man in a telegrapher's green eyeshade, the railroad's own signalman who had been brought in to manage the test run. Cole had spent the previous day talking to the two men in the town jail, and one of them, facing a long stay and the town's wrath, had finally broken, trading a name and a story for a promise of Judge Pike's mercy. The signalman had been the final piece of the puzzle. Cole led his three witnesses to stand beside June. Judge Preacher Pike was the last to arrive. He carried a heavy, leather-bound book of territorial statutes under one arm and his gavel in his hand. He did not acknowledge Bragg, but walked directly to the center of the platform and turned to face the town. "Mr. Bragg has insisted on this public meeting." Pike's voice boomed, carrying easily over the nervous crowd. "He wishes to present his final offer before the arrival of the train, but before any offers are considered, I believe it is my duty to read a pertinent clause from the contract itself." Bragg's smile faltered. "That is not necessary, Judge. It is a standard right-of-way agreement." "The people have a right to know what they are signing," Pike retorted, his eyes flashing. He took one of the contracts from Bragg's portfolio and held it up. He scanned the dense script. Then his finger stopped on a paragraph of text so small it was almost illegible. He read it aloud, his voice slow and deliberate, each word dropping like a stone into the silence. "In the event of civil unrest, public disturbance, or any perceived risk of instability that may threaten the security or timely completion of the railroad's operations," he read, "the Chartered Consortium reserves the right of immediate and full seizure of any adjacent properties deemed a public hazard, with compensation to be determined at a later date by the consortium itself." A wave of shock and anger rippled through the crowd. It was a trap, a legal snare hidden in the fine print. Any protest, any argument, could be twisted and defined as instability, giving Bragg the right to take everything for nothing. "It is merely a boilerplate security clause," Bragg blustered, his face beginning to flush. "A formality." "It is the claw inside the velvet glove," Pike said grimly. Cole stepped forward. He held up a small, leather-bound ledger book. It was the kind used for business accounts. "This was found in the pocket of one of the men who set fire to the storehouse," he said, his voice calm and clear. "It seems he was a meticulous record-keeper." He opened the book and held it up for Pike. The pages were filled with neat entries. Payment for 2 good ropes, cut clean. Payment for 5 gallons of kerosene. An entry for a bonus upon completion of the bridge fire. He turned a page. And here, a final entry. Full payment for services rendered, signed with the initials S.B. He then produced one of the maps from June's satchel and laid it beside the ledger. The embossed seal on the map, a capital B, was an identical match to the flourishes on the signature in the book. It was undeniable. Bragg was cornered, his lies stripped bare. "Forged," he shouted, his voice cracking. "All of it, a forgery by this vagrant." It was then that the young signalman stepped forward, his hands trembling as he twisted his green eyeshade. "It's no forgery," he said, his voice shaking but determined. Mr. Bragg, he came to me last night." All eyes turned to the young man. "He told me the schedule. He gave me a special instruction. He wanted me to signal an emergency stop, a brake failure. He wanted the train to stop right here." The signalman pointed a shaking finger toward the newly framed storehouse. "As close to that new construction as possible. He said the sudden stop, the engine so close to the town, would be all the instability he needed to invoke that clause and take everything." The confession settled over the crowd, a final damning revelation. Bragg's entire scheme was exposed, a symphony of sabotage and legal deceit designed to manufacture a crisis that would allow him to steal their homes. In the distance, a new sound began to build, a low rumble that vibrated up through the soles of their feet. A lonely whistle echoed from the plains, long and mournful. The train was coming. The sound grew, the earth beginning to tremble. The black engine appeared on the horizon, a monster of smoke and steam, growing larger with terrifying speed. It wasn't slowing down. It thundered toward the temporary station, steam hissing, its massive steel wheels a blur of motion. The crowd gasped, stumbling back from the platform. Then came a piercing, deafening screech of metal on metal as the engineer threw the brakes. Sparks showered from the wheels, and the massive machine bucked and groaned, protesting the violent command to stop. It slid past the platform, the heat from the boiler washing over the crowd, and finally shuddered to a halt. The front of the engine just yards from the storehouse frame, exactly as Bragg had planned. In the ringing silence that followed, as the steam hissed and the great machine panted like a winded beast, the townspeople did not run. They turned, as one. They moved forward, their silence more menacing than any shout. They flowed around the platform, a human wall, cutting Silas Bragg off from any escape. He was trapped. His plan had succeeded in its mechanics and failed in its execution. He looked at the hard, unforgiving faces surrounding him, and the mask of civility finally shattered, revealing the desperate, cornered rat beneath. June stepped up onto the wooden crate where her evidence lay. She was not tall, but in that moment, she seemed to command the entire scene. She looked not at Bragg, but at her friends and neighbors. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was filled with the strength of a church bell. "Slow down," she said, the words a calm rebuke to the violent speed of the train and the frantic greed of the man on the platform. "We are a town of laws. We will sign when the law is clear and fair to all, not before." The sight of his ultimate defeat, orchestrated by this woman and the silent drifter beside her, finally broke something in Bragg. His face contorted in a snarl of pure hatred. His hand darted inside his coat, emerging with a gleaming, nickel-plated revolver. He pointed it directly at June. "The contracts will be signed now," he screamed, his voice a raw shriek of desperation. The crowd surged, a wave of anger and fear, but before anyone could move, Cole stepped forward. He moved with a calm, unhurried grace that was terrifying in its intensity. He did not draw his own gun. He walked directly into the path of Bragg's revolver until the muzzle was just inches from his chest. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. Then, Cole slowly raised his right hand, the hand that had been locked in a fist of grief for 5 years, the hand that June had taught him to open. It was steady, the fingers loose and relaxed. He did not try to grab the gun. He simply placed his open palm over the end of the barrel, his flesh covering the dark, circular void. It was an act of impossible courage, a statement more powerful than any bullet. It was the final, absolute rejection of the violence that had haunted his life. He was no longer a man ruled by fire and fear. He was a shield. Bragg stared, his mind unable to process the action. He looked from Cole's calm, unwavering eyes to the open hand covering his gun. He saw no fear, only a profound and unbreakable peace. His own hand began to tremble. Two members of the town patrol, moving with swift efficiency, seized Bragg from behind, wrenching the useless gun from his nerveless fingers. It was over. As they led the sputtering, defeated man away, a long, loud blast erupted from the steam engine. The whistle blew, a triumphant, ear-splitting cry of release that echoed across the plains, washing over the town of Cold Rock like a cleansing wave. The train had arrived, but the future it brought was no longer Bragg's. It was their own. With Bragg and his men in the custody of the town patrol, a strange and profound quiet fell over the crowd. The massive steam engine, which had been the instrument of his final, failed threat, now seemed like a tired, slumbering beast, its hissing steam a soft sigh of relief. The engineer, a man with a face like a leather map, leaned out of the cab and gave Judge Pike a slow, respectful nod. There was no cheering, no wild celebration. The victory was too hard won, the threat too close for simple jubilation. Instead, a deep, collective breath was taken by the people of Cold Rock. They had faced down the future and bent it to their will. They had not rejected progress. They had simply demanded that it respect their home. Judge Pike, standing on the makeshift platform, looked out at the faces of his town. He saw weariness, yes, but beneath it, he saw a new and unshakable resolve. He held up the fraudulent contract, and with a deliberate motion, he tore it in half, then in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the ground like dead leaves. "The contracts are void," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of both law and scripture. "Cold Rock will form its own council. We will negotiate with the Union Pacific as equals, not as supplicants. We will decide our own future." He closed his heavy book of statutes with a solid thud. "This town keeps its land, and it keeps its people." It was a benediction and a promise. In the days that followed, a quiet but profound shift occurred. The temporary tracks were removed, the special engine was gone, the railroad was still coming, but now it would come on their terms. The immediate, suffocating pressure was gone, replaced by the familiar rhythms of work and life. The sun was low in the sky, casting long, golden fingers of light across the land. In the small garden behind the eatery, the air was warm and smelled of rich, damp earth and the sweet perfume of tomato vines. Bees hummed a lazy, contented tune as they moved among the squash blossoms. This was June's sanctuary, the small patch of ground that had been the anchor of her world. Cole was there. He was driving a series of tall, slender poles into the soft earth, his movements steady and sure. He was building a trellis, a framework for her climbing beams to reach for the sun. The sound of his mallet striking the wood was a soft, rhythmic thud, a sound of creation, not destruction. He worked with a patient focus, his body moving with the easy grace of a man who had finally found a task worth doing. The restlessness that had once defined him, the constant need to look over his shoulder, was gone. He was present, rooted in the simple, honest labor of making something grow. He finished the last pole, testing its strength with his hand. He stood back, his eyes surveying his work. It was a simple structure, just wood and twine, but it was straight and strong. It was a promise of a future harvest. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the old brass lighter. He held it in his open palm, the metal warm from the sun. He looked at it for a long moment. He saw not the fire of a burning barn, but the faint, ghostly image of a 12-year-old boy with a gap-toothed smile. It was not a brand of guilt anymore. It was just a memory, a piece of his brother he could carry without being consumed by it. He walked to the back steps of the eatery, the threshold between the garden and the kitchen, between the outside world and the home. He bent down and placed the lighter on the top step. In a patch of late afternoon sun, it sat there, gleaming softly. It was not a thing to be hidden in a dark pocket, nor a ghost to be outrun. It was just a part of his story, now laid out in the open, in the place he intended to stay. He was still looking at it when June came out the back door, wiping her hands on her apron. She stopped when she saw the lighter. She looked from it to the newly built trellis, to the man standing in her garden. She saw the profound peace that had settled in his eyes, a stillness that had not been there before. She walked down the steps and stood before him, the scent of baking bread clinging to her clothes. The space between them was charged, not with the frantic energy of crisis, but with a quiet, powerful anticipation. She looked into his eyes, and her own were filled with a fierce, unwavering light. "Go slow this time," she said, her voice low and soft, yet carrying the strength of an unbreakable vow. She took a half-step closer, her gaze holding his. "But don't you dare leave." A slow smile spread across Cole's face. It was not the thin, mirthless twist of his lips she had seen before. This was a real smile, one that started in his eyes and transformed his entire face, erasing the hard lines of pain and loneliness. He slowly raised his right hand, the one he had held open to a loaded gun, and gently cupped her cheek. His touch was warm and steady. "I'm staying," he said, his voice a deep, quiet promise that she felt down to her bones, slow and deep. He lowered his head, and she rose on her toes to meet him. Their kiss was not a sudden, passionate crash. It was a gentle, searching exploration, as hesitant and hopeful as the first green shoots of spring. It tasted of dust and sun, of bean soup and wood smoke. It was a kiss that spoke not of fairy tale endings, but of real and difficult beginnings. It was a promise, sealed not with words, but with a profound and simple truth. As they stood there by the bean trellis, the setting sun bathing them in a warm, honey-colored light, the sound of a hammer striking nails carried over from the new storehouse. It was the rhythm of a town healing itself, the sound of a future being built, one board, one nail, one day at a time. Later that evening, the scheduled freight train rumbled past on the main line in the distance. Its whistle blew, a long, lonely cry in the gathering twilight. But this time, it was not a sound of escape or of a world leaving Cole behind. It was just a train, passing by a town that was standing its ground, a town that had become a destination in its own right. Cold Rock was staying put. Inside the warm, lamp-lit kitchen of the eatery, June sat at the table. In her hands was the linen wrap from Cole's knuckles. With a needle and thread, she was adding a final, reinforcing line of stitches, making it whole and strong. Across from her, Cole knelt by the cast-iron stove. He opened the small door and began to lay kindling for the morning fire. The small, quiet acts of two people building a life. A home was beginning. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment below to connect and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.